I turn it over to Senator Cruz.
Thank you. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. For a year now, we've faced COVID-19 in the United States and across the world. Over 500,000 Americans have lost their lives. Over 42,000 Texans have lost their lives to COVID-19. Joe Biden says the top priority of the Biden administration is to defeat this pandemic. And yet the Biden nominee to lead the Health and Human Services Agency is an individual who is woefully unqualified and has absolutely zero experience in anything related to health care. Xavier Becerra is not a doctor. He's not a scientist. He's never worked in health care. He's never worked at a hospital. He has no experience in virology. He has no experience in pharmaceuticals. As far as I can tell, the only connection Mr. Becerra has to health care is that he sued the Little Sisters of the Poor. In the midst of a global pandemic, we need a leader who can actually lead the Health and Human Services Department to defeat this pandemic. The fact that Joe Biden was willing to nominate Xavier Becerra illustrates that the priorities of the Biden administration are all about partisan politics. The reason Becerra got this nomination is he's a left-wing activist. He's a trial lawyer. And he spent a career as a radical pro-abortion activist, attacking and persecuting anyone who's pro-life and pushing an extreme left-wing agenda. That's why he got the nomination. In an ordinary time, that might be one thing. But this isn't an ordinary time, and I will say this. If any Republican president nominated as Secretary of HHS someone with no health care experience, who wasn't a doctor, with no scientific experience, with no background at all, in the middle of a global pandemic, that Republican president would be laughed out of the room. It would be absurd. And yet it appears an awful lot of Democrats are willing just to rubber stamp putting a partisan extremist in this job rather than someone with experience. Let me note one other aspect. We are in the midst of an incredible logistical challenge of delivering hundreds of millions of vaccines. Tens of millions of vaccines have already been administered, but hundreds of millions need to be administered. Mr. Becerra has zero experience in logistics and distribution, in the mechanics of helping combat this pandemic. And I hope that the Senate will stand together in a bipartisan manner and say, we need an expert, we need a scientist, we need someone who knows something about health care leading the Health and Human Services Department.
Good afternoon, everybody. As a practicing obstetrician for 25 years, I delivered thousands of babies, the honor of a lifetime. I never would have dreamed that I would come to the halls of Congress and have to fight harder to protect the lives of babies than I did in those delivery rooms for all those deliveries. I never dreamed that I'd be here standing as a senator having to protect the conscience objections of people in the healthcare industry, something that we should all be respecting. Can you imagine just the number of young people that will not go into healthcare, doctors and nurses, if they can't have a conscience objection to not participate in certain procedures like abortions? I just don't think that America thinks that's right. I think it takes away our freedom of religion and so many of our freedoms, and we can't see this happening. This HHS Secretary nomination is an extremist on abortion. He sued the Little Sisters of the Poor and has zero health care experience. There's no way I can support him. I think we owe too much to the American public to have somebody with health care experience that can see us through the COVID virus and on to bigger health care issues as well. Thank you so much.
So we have a bill that deals with conscience protections. You would think that just because we have federal law that HHS would protect the conscience of individuals, because it's already federal law that healthcare workers have conscience protections. But with Xavier Becerra and what he did not do when he was in California protecting healthcare workers there, we have a bill that actually adds some teeth to federal law to say that individuals, if their conscience is violated and their healthcare location requires them to participate in an assisted suicide or an abortion, that they can then have a private right of action against that institution so that they have some way to be able to enforce their rights if the federal government won't protect their rights. So we have that bill to be able to add that to current federal law, because we believe that federal law should be enforced and not have a situation where a new Secretary of HHS comes in and says, yes, I know it's federal law, but I fought it when I was in California and I'm not going to enforce it when I actually come here. He actually called some of the conscience protections when he was in California illegal, but they actually are federal law here. That is not someone who's going to line up and say they're going to actually follow the law once they get here. So be glad to be able to take a couple of questions if you have it. I'd like to restrict our questions just to the area of Xavier Becerra and conscience protections. I know there's a lot of issues, but that's why this particular group gathered today. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, I wanted to ask, in general, this has been a tough week for Biden's nominees. Do you think that Tandon and Becerra should rescind their nominations?
I think they both should be rescinded on that, and that's been pretty clear. And we've been pretty clear on that. In fact, I've written letters to the Biden team to say, please send us somebody that's a scientist, that's a doctor, that's somebody in the middle of the pandemic can actually help us deal with the health care issue.
Senator, do you think there are going to be any Republican votes for Becerra at this point?
Don't know. Not of the group up here, I can assure you of that, but I've not counted everyone else.
My question is actually for each gentleman, Senators Marshall and Cruz in particular. You guys have voted against, I think you're up to 9 Biden cabinet nominees at this point. I think you might be at 7. Why should people look at this as a good faith complaint about this nominee and not just a desire to vote against every person Joe Biden puts forward?
Well, there are a number of nominees who have been extreme, and you're right, I voted against a number of them. I voted for the Defense Secretary, but the others I voted against. There is a difference between some of those nominations and Xavier Becerra's. His record, he's utterly unqualified for the position. He has no health care background. He has nothing even credible. I don't know if he stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but he has... The man has no background whatsoever, and this is the preeminent crisis facing the country. He also has a radical record that stands out. There are a number of nominees whose records are troubling. But you take, for example, Tony Blinken, the nominee for Secretary of State. I voted against Tony Blinken, but I also spent an hour and a half in my office talking with Tony. I look forward to working with him as Secretary of State, and I'm hopeful. I voted against him and a number of Biden nominees because they had executed a pivot towards China and a softening towards communist China that I think is a mistake. There's a difference between that and a nominee who is woefully unqualified. And I would note, none of Becerra's defenders have come back with anything and said, no, he does know something about health care. He knows something about medicine. He knows something about science. The Democrats, as a talking point, like to say they care about science. And yet, in the middle of a global pandemic, they want someone leading the Health and Human Services Agency who has zero scientific background. That's unacceptable on the merits, and it shows, I think, the wrong priorities.
Senator Marshall, why is this a good faith no vote if